Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little video that I found very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video overall by that of the YouTube channel, Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation. And of course, for those of you that have been around my channel for a little while, you know that I tend to like to review this channel, usually because, in my opinion, Dante is up to some sort of bullshit. But at the end of the day, I thought that this video would be very particularly interesting. Not only to talk about Mr. Danny Swift Garcia and the most recent ass whooping that he just laid on Mr. Jose Benavidez Jr., I believe, in his first performance at 154 pounds. It was a very decent performance over a fighter that could have potentially given him some problems. Now, do I believe that Jose Benavidez ever was an A-grade fighter? No, I do not. I've been saying that for a very decently long time. But overall, for the size of Jose Benavidez overall, and from somewhat of the skill set that he little does have, it was a decently impressive performance. To be quite honest with you, at least the rounds that I was able to see, to be honest with you, I think maybe I gave Jose Benavidez one round. Maybe there was a couple of rounds that you could have gave him, but I'm pretty sure that I scored that fight 11 rounds to 1. There was one judge, I believe, that scored that fight, I think, a draw. I have no idea what type of meth he was on, but it is what it is. I believe that there was another judge that had it 116 to 114. Even that judge, I think, was under the influence. But overall, at the end of the day, the right man did win. I think that Danny Garcia put on a very, very decent performance. But Danny Garcia, of course, is going through some of the motions right now. He overall is going through certain things mentally. And I think a big part of the reason why that is because Mr. Danny Garcia, I think all in all, that some of the losses that he has taken in his career, of course, have led to certain heartbreak and have led to certain depression. And that's just natural with certain fighters, especially. It just is what it is. Of course, nobody likes to lose. But of course, on the grand scale of boxing, when it comes down to it, it's even worse. Because not only do you lose, but basically you have to swallow the pill that you got your ass kicked. And the way that I see it when it comes down to it, and if I had to imagine, because this is just the way that I would think about it if I ended up losing a fight on the professional scale. Basically, if someone whooped my ass or dominated me in a fight, basically, all in all, on the world-class level scale, basically what they have to think is, wow, if I really overall had to fight that dude in the street, or overall if it came down to a fight for the death. Now, maybe there's certain fighters that don't think this way, but certain fighters I'm sure do. If I had to protect my family from that guy, or if I had to fight, this guy to the death, there's a chance that I would not win that fight. And not only does that squash his pride, but all in all, it may squash a little bit of their mental health. It just is what it is. There's many fighters, not even just many fighters, but many athletes after certain things have happened that they have suffered from a great amount of depression. Some of them even become drug addicts, like that of an Oscar De La Hoya. So it is what it is. Or overall, they get involved with a bunch of overeating, like that of a Ricky Hatton. But anyways, we're going to talk about this in the video because I just thought that it would be very particularly interesting to talk about. Mr. Danny Garcia, I don't really know what he said in the post-fight interview. I did some research, but I was not able to see it at the end of the day. Apparently, according to certain channels, allegedly Danny Garcia made some excuses to why he lost to Errol Spence Jr. Whether that is true or not, I can't really tell you once again because I did not see the post-fight interview. But I thought that I would talk about Danny Garcia and, in my opinion, overall where he is at this point in time in his career and how good or how great or how not a great of a fighter I find him to be. But anyways, we're going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? First things first, there is no other sport on the planet that produces as many excuses for losing as this sport right here does. When you watch NBA games, NFL, baseball games, if a team loses and that team is interviewed afterwards, all you hear is congratulations to the team that won, the team that beat them. You will seldomly hear a football player saying, we lost the Super Bowl because I was dealing with mental health issues. Going into this game, I just wasn't myself.
Well, Dante, that means that you don't watch a whole lot of other sports. Now, there may be a certain amount of other people that maybe do not pull the mental health issue out of their ass. But the thing overall is this. No matter what competition, no matter what sport that you watch, there's always going to be excuses because people are very, very prideful and they don't want to admit just flat out that they ended up getting beat. Because basically what that would you be admitting is that that person was just better than me. Even certain fighters that, even if you were to take a look at Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield today, if they were to have sit down interviews, Mike Tyson, when he talks about Evander Holyfield, he will not even say that Evander Holyfield was the better fighter. He will say that you were better than me on the night. That's what many fighters overall say. And to a degree, I get it, because you have to be somewhat delusional in that mind to believe that even if you lose to that fighter, even a couple of times in a row, you can potentially beat them at any moment in time. You have to have that mentality. And if you don't have that mentality, then overall it's going to be possibly a very dangerous situation for you. Or overall, you may be able to lose some of your bigger fights in your career. Because sometimes the confidence level overall and being able to be calm under pressure and believing in yourself to beat that opponent, that is the difference sometimes. Even that little bit of a shred of a difference is the difference overall, maybe between that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. and maybe like someone overall, if we were to compare, maybe like that of a Shane Mosley or someone else like that. And also combined with the intelligence and the boxing skill, yada yada yada. But there's a bunch of excuses for other sports, especially by that of the media. If we were to take a look at NBA basketball, LeBron James, who probably is the most protected athlete in all of sports today, he has excuses upon excuses upon excuses, not only for himself, but from many of the media members overall, especially on an ESPN panel. If we were to talk about the tennis world, Novak Djokovic is the only one that I see that the mainstream media does not usually make excuses for. But if there are excuses to be made, usually they'll make them for Rafael Nadal or Mr. Roger Federer especially, and Serena Williams, of course. We all know what happened when she had that one meltdown. I believe it was either in the 2018 or 2019 U.S. Open when she was getting her ass whooped by Naomi Osaka in that final. And people tried to say that the umpire cheated her when no such thing happened. She just had overall a toxic outburst. It just is what it is. And of course, when it comes to Mr. Aaron Rodgers or other football players, people also make excuses when it comes to him. So excuses are just prominent no matter what sport you're going to go into, not only because there's a great amount of pride there, but also, when it comes to fans, they're pretty much just as prideful, debatably, over their guys when it comes down to it, as what some other people are, or overall maybe potentially as what the main athlete is. Anyway.
There was a lot of stuff going on. The reason why we lost this game is because I had a lot of stuff that I was dealing with when it comes to my family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying 100% of the time.
Oh, you mean like how Deontay Wilder said that after he ended up getting his ass completely canoed against Tyson Fury? Is that what you mean, Dante? Anyway, and you seem to not mind Deontay Wilder's excuses whatsoever. In fact, I remember quite vividly that when Deontay Wilder lost, apparently the reason overall why people were getting after him so bad was only because he's a black fighter. And don't get me wrong, are there certain black fighters or black athletes that receive more scrutiny than maybe that of other demographics? Sure, you can argue that. But the reason why Deontay Wilder was getting so much scrutiny was because he was making some of the dumbest excuses that I've ever seen in my life. I mean, all the way from, my trainer, he was in on it. He poisoned my water. There's egg weights in the gloves. He put his hands lower into the gloves so he would hit me with the palm or hit me with the knuckles. I mean, it was all just so stupid with really no evidence whatsoever. And on top of that, you're trying to tamper a man's name in Mr. Tyson Fury. At least when it comes to Danny Garcia, if he overall did allege that the reason why he lost to Errol Spence was because of mental health issues, at least he's not really trying to tamper with Errol Spence's name. Now, one can say overall that, with Errol Spence, that he's trying to tamper the win. And of course, at the end of the day, something does need to be said on that. But the reason why Deontay Wilder, for example, was really overall so scrutinized by the media is because he was coming up with some of the most low IQ excuses I've ever heard in my life, with no evidence whatsoever. And Dante, one of these damn idiots, he was one of the dudes overall that were piggybacking on one of those excuses. Anyway.
95% of the time, you will mainly hear athletes in other sports congratulate the other team. You will rarely ever hear them trying to take credit away from the other team for beating them. You hear this in boxing more than 90% of the time. And the reason why is because boxing is more of an individual sport. If you lose, you have no one else to blame but yourself. On top,
I would agree with you there. I think that that's a very, very decent point. And that is a part of the reason why so many boxers, and not just boxers, but MMA fighters, why they make excuses to why they lose. When Vasily Lomachenko lost to Teofimo Lopez, he had an excuse overall, allegedly because of his shoulder. Now, a lot of people, of course, believe that excuse. Whether it's real or not, who knows? Vasily Lomachenko has had shoulder issues in the past, but at the end of the day, you clearly thought that you were in good enough condition when it comes down to it all in all to beat Teofimo Lopez because you signed the contract, and on top of that, you never pulled out of the fight. So at the end of the day, I don't want to hear any complaining. Manny Pacquiao made the excuse against Floyd Mayweather Jr. We all know that Deontay Wilder had dozens upon dozens of excuses against Tyson Fury, and there's a multitude of other fighters that have had excuses. Guillermo Rigondeaux had an excuse about his hand after he lost to Vasily Lomachenko when there was no evidence of a hand injury. He just quit, and there's a certain amount of other fighters that you can debate as well. In boxing, we're going to see a certain amount of excuses, but it is also important to talk about overall excuses and overall to somewhat, overall, what's really the word that I'm looking for here? Kind of overall to talk about how it's not good to make excuses. And the reason why that is because you're never going to become a better person if you live on excuses. You have to adapt. You have to become more intelligent as a person. And we have to we have to learn from all of our mistakes. That's how we get better as people. And that's how we get better at our craft or whatever the hell we're going to do. And unfortunately for Danny Garcia, not only overall did he make excuses for the Keith Thurman and overall that of the Sean Porter losses because allegedly he believes that he beat them. And I get it to a degree. They were decently competitive fights. But Danny Garcia or someone in his corner, in my opinion, should have told him, no, Danny, you did not do enough to win those fights. In my opinion, Danny, with his ability, he potentially could have had enough to beat those guys because there's certain things that Danny does decently well. Now, when it comes to an Errol Spence Jr., I don't think Danny Garcia is ever going to defeat someone like that of an Errol Spence Jr. Danny Garcia, when it comes down to it, if I were to compare him to a fighter, what he almost reminds me of the Miguel Cotto of his generation, except not as great as what Miguel Cotto was. Miguel Cotto, in my opinion, he's almost like the Tommy Hearns of his generation, or the Oscar De La Hoya, the Shane Mosley. That's what Miguel Cotto was for his generation. Whenever people talk about the four big kings, usually Tommy Hearns is regarded in either third or fourth place when it comes to the four kings because Tommy Hearns usually lost the battles to all of those guys, usually. Now, he did defeat Roberto Duran, but Tommy Hearns was a dude that was about 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. You're supposed to defeat a dude who started off at his career as a natural lightweight. It just is what it is. But Tommy Hearns, whenever he fought that of a Sugar Ray Leonard, or whenever he fought that overall, that of a Marvin Hagler, he ended up usually losing. Now, I do believe that, he ended up winning the Sugar Ray Leonard rematch, or he should have, and that was scored a draw. But other than that, Tommy Hearns, you can argue in certain fights that he did not perform as well as maybe what he should have. And that's kind of what Miguel Cotto was overall for that of the 2000s and the 2010s. Miguel Cotto was not going to ever be Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao at his best or a Canelo Alvarez overall at that point in time in his career. But if you were any grade below that, more than likely he was going to beat you unless you had some certain physical advantages. That's kind of what Danny Garcia is, just a lesser version. Now, do I believe that he fights as similarly as what Miguel Cotto did? Do I believe that he has as high a boxing IQ or the power or the athleticism or the defensive responsibility of a Miguel Cotto? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, Danny Garcia, that's kind of what he is. In my opinion, he is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He has some very, very decent wins in his career, and he is a very decent boxer. But the problem with Danny Garcia, in my opinion, is that he believes that, at least this is my view, I think that Danny Garcia believes that he's way more slicker than what he actually is. I think that when I take a look at Danny Garcia, he believes that he's some sort of Floyd Mayweather Jr. in there. And a lot of the times, he just overall does not fight up to par, especially when he faces these super athletic fighters that can compete with him in terms of skills. Because Danny Garcia, in my view, when we talk about a Keith Thurman or a Sean Porter, I think that if he got the proper mindset, he could potentially beat those guys when it comes down to it all in all. But Danny Garcia, he just doesn't throw enough in my opinion, and he believes that his counterpunching ability is way greater than what it actually is. Now, he is a very decent counterpuncher, but a lot of the times the reason why he usually gets outdone by some of these fighters, and when it comes to an Errol Spence Jr., in my view, that's going to take a very, very rare caliber type of fighter to beat that of an Errol Spence Jr. But he could have won, in my opinion, potentially the Sean Porter fight and the Keith Thurman fights, but he did not throw enough in that fight. His counterpunching ability is not as good as what he thinks that it is when it comes down to it. And on top of that, he just needed to do more. And if someone would have told Danny that, he probably overall potentially could have won those two fights. But it just is what it is.
That it's mano a mano. It's a gladiator sport. So more testosterone is involved. I mean, to acknowledge that another man beat your ass is a hard pill to swallow. And this is one of the reasons why boxing.
I would agree with that, Dante. I would agree that it is a very hard pill to swallow for a lot of these fighters and just athletes in general that they were not the better man on that night, or all in all, that this person may be better than me. It kills them a lot of the times because, they're very, very competitive and they want to be the best overall in their sport. And when they figure out that they met a man overall that was better, a lot of the times, all in all, they reminisce about it and they get very, very depressed. Ricky Hatton was known for depression. I believe Mike Tyson was known for depression. Teofimo Lopez has shown his certain bouts of depression, and there's been a few other fighters, I believe, as well. Actually, not even just a few, many, many other fighters as well. And I'm sure Deontay Wilder is going through a great depression right now as well. At least he was.
It's far more mental than it is physical. Not only do you have to be mentally strong inside of the ring during combat,
Well, boxing is a very great mental sport. And whatever sport that you're going to go into, really no matter what you do, it's oftentimes, a lot of the times, usually going to be more mental than what it is physical. But the physical, all in all, is still going to be very decently important. Because if you have a person that is highly intelligent, but on top of that also has the physicality and has overall the athletic ability, you're probably not going to beat that fighter. Certain fighters like a Manny Pacquiao, a Floyd Mayweather Jr., a Roy Jones Jr., a Rocky Marciano back in the day, a Lennox Lewis, a Muhammad Ali, fighters like that, a Canelo Alvarez today, if they have both the athleticism and the mentality, more than likely, and the boxing IQ, it's going to be very, very hard to defeat those fighters. It just is. Tyson Fury, that's another one I can throw up there as well.
Also have to be strong.
And Errol Spence, in my view, is one of those fighters. He's on that level. Errol Spence overall is on that debatable number one pound for pound spot. Danny Garcia, in my opinion, has just never been on that level. In my opinion, he's about a level or two below that of Errol Spence Jr. In my opinion, he's an A-minus fighter. I would probably say that, in my view, at least skill for skill, he's probably around the same area as what one of the Charlo brothers would be. And a lot of people would say, what? How could you say that? In my opinion, the Charlo brothers, they're very decent fighters, but I think that had they actually fought someone that was actually an A-plus fighter, I think overall that they pretty much would be exposed for some of the faults that they would have. They're a little bit too straightforward. They think that their counterpunching ability is a decent amount greater than what it actually is. And don't get me wrong, they do have very great counterpunching ability. They also rely a lot on their power, but they do not have the best of feet. They do not overall have the best of movement. Actually, some of the problems that Danny Garcia has. Now, I don't think Danny Garcia actually has the worst footwork in the world, but he is not the fastest fighter in the world. And on top of that, sometimes overall he is just not first enough, and overall he does not put on the pressure enough. And that's what lost him 2 out of his 3 fights. Now, he could have done anything against Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, and he would have not beat him. Because Danny, in my opinion, he just does not have the skills, he does not have the ability, and on top of that, even though he is a great athlete, he does not have the athleticism to defeat that of an Errol Spence Jr. If you're going to defeat someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Manny Pacquiao or an Errol Spence Jr. or a Canelo Alvarez, someone that at one point in time could have debatably been the number one pound-for-pound fighter within their sport, you're going to have to be usually a very decently all-around great caliber fighter, not even just intellectually overall and not even just mentally tough, but also you're going to have the physical game as well. Because every single all-time great fighter that usually was there, they had that complete package.
Mentally outside of the ring, before the fight, and after the fight, particularly if you lose. This is the reason why a lot of boxers are usually never the same after they suffer their first loss, regardless if they get knocked out or just get completely dominated, because it will affect you psychologically depending on the fighter. Especially when you've been told for so many years, you're going to be the best. You're going to be sitting on the top of the sport. You're going to be considered pound for pound. You have a lot of family members that have all of these high expectations for you. But then reality hits. You get in the ring with fighters that are better than you.
Family members or mega fanboys. Just like when DontesBoxingNation, he had that Deontay Wilder expectations. And overall, Deontay felt that much more pressure when it came down to it because he had his little fan base overall that was making excuses for him. But anyway.
And you have to now accept the fact that you're not the best in the sport that you have dedicated your entire life to. And this is exactly what Danny Garcia is going through right now. This is what he's dealing with. See, when it comes to a
I would agree.
fighter like Danny Garcia, Danny was extremely successful, especially as an amateur. He was beating a lot of the big names that we see in the sport today. I believe even as a win.
Well, Danny Garcia has been successful in the amateurs, and he's also been successful in the pros. Let's not disregard Danny Garcia and what he's done. He is a legitimate two-weight division champion. And Danny Garcia, when it comes down to it, who the hell knows? He may become a three-weight division champion or a four-weight division champion. I'm not quite sure if I see him becoming a four-weight division champion. But if he somehow became a three-weight division champion, I wouldn't be shocked. I wouldn't be shocked. The 154-pound division, in my opinion, it's not extraordinarily talented. But all in all, when it comes down to it, he is going to have a tough time with some of those fighters there, because not only when it comes down to it are some of them at least B-grade fighters, but on top of that, they're going to be a little bit bigger than him. And Danny Garcia, in my opinion, sometimes has a problem with certain fighters that have around the same level of boxing IQ as what he does, or on top of that, can compete with him physically. And if he even gets in the ring with certain fighters like that of a Tim Tszyu, or a fighter all in all, even like that of a Tony Harrison, a fighter that, I've even considered sometimes a C-grade fighter. And some people have debated me on that, but to me, he's either C plus or B minus, somewhere around there. Pretty much a coin toss for that. Even if Danny Garcia got in a fight with some of those guys, I'm not quite sure if he would beat those guys. Because Danny Garcia, in my opinion, what he's really suffering from, in my view, is that sometimes he does not know what to do in some of those big spots. And like I said, he believes that he's that much better than what he actually is. But anyway.
Over Terrence Crawford as an amateur. But since he turned pro, once he reached a certain level and he started fighting these top-notch, athletic, black, undefeated welterweights, and once again, he was fighting in the deepest division in the sport, so he was fighting against the best of the best. And unfortunately for Danny Garcia, the same success that he got in the amateurs, he did not get in the pros. And every single time, once again, he stepped up in competition, he would lose. So when he makes excuses for why he lost to Errol Spence,
Well, Danny Garcia got some decent wins in his career, but whenever he fought a fighter that was around his own same level, he pretty much lost that fight. So Danny Garcia, when it comes down to it, he's kind of on that same level overall as and a lot of people may not agree with this. It's almost kind of like Mike Tyson like, and certain people overall, they're not going to agree with that. Now, would I put Danny Garcia necessarily on the same all-time great level as a Mike Tyson? No, not necessarily. But Danny Garcia, that's what he's going to be remembered as. He's going to be remembered as a fighter that was a very good fighter, maybe even decently great fighter. But a lot of the times when he fought a fighter that was on a similar caliber, he ended up losing that fight. All right, so it just is what it is. But he did end up getting victories over Lucas Matisse, Lamont Peterson, Amir Khan. He is a two-weight division champion. Robert Guerrero, Paulie Malignaggi, and not every single one of those fighters that I just named are clear A-grade fighters, if any of them. But that is, in my opinion, going to make him go into the Hall of Fame. He certainly is greater than fighters, in my view, like that of a Paulie Malignaggi or Zab Judah, or that overall of, what the hell is his name, Adrian Broner. In my opinion, Danny Garcia is better than those guys. And if we were really going to debate about it, let's say if we were going to debate Danny Garcia and Mikey Garcia in their peak form, they're about on the same level, in my opinion. Mikey, in terms of boxing ability, I would say probably is slightly over that of Danny Garcia. But in terms of resume, you would debate probably that Danny Garcia has some better wins in his career than what Mikey does. Because Mikey really has no overall, just 100% for sure A-grade wins.
This is something that has been consecutive when it comes to Danny Garcia's career, him losing when he steps up in competition. It's pretty ironic when you think about it. Danny Garcia had already lost to fighters that were not as skilled. They were not as good as Errol Spence. Danny already lost to Sean Porter. He already lost to Keith Thurman, regardless of how competitive the fights.
That's right. He did lose to Errol Spence Jr. when he already lost to Sean Porter and lost to Keith one-time Thurman. So I wonder, Dante, does that basically mean that the Danny Swift Garcia win doesn't count for Errol Spence Jr.? Because we all know what you would be saying if that was Mr. Canelo Alvarez. Apparently, Canelo Alvarez only goes after fighters, all in all, that are either A, slim pickings or easy pickings, or B, already have losses. So basically, Dante is like, well, I don't even count the, Laura or the Danny Jacob wins. So is it the same thing with Errol Spence? I highly doubt it.
He lost to these fighters.
Now, don't get me wrong, there are certain fighters that do have multiple losses on their record that are pretty much washed up. But certain fighters, like when Canelo fought Danny Jacobs or when he fought Lara, those fighters are pretty much at the peak form of their career. Now, when Terrence Crawford, for example, if we're going to talk about him, when he fought someone like a Kell Brook or an Amir Khan, those fighters were never ever going to have a chance of winning another belt or winning another A-grade fight in their career ever again. Never, never, ever again. So those fighters were completely done. But overall, when someone like an Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, beat a Kell Brook, or when he beat someone like a Danny Garcia or Sean Porter, those fighters are not washed up because you could tell that they were still very decently competitive. Anyway.
And then once he...
So that's why it's very important for us to be very logical and objective and to keep things into context, because not every fighter ages or overreacts the same. Anyway.
Loses to someone even better than them, which is Errol Spence, Danny Garcia's excuse is even more elaborate. You guys know he just beat Jose Benavidez this past weekend, and after that fight, and even leading up to the fight, he started to pull the mental health card. He talked about how he was dealing with depression, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. It's a real thing. Guys, I think it's gotten to the point to where boxers like Ryan Garcia and now Danny Garcia, they are making a mockery out of mental health. There are people that...
Well, what I need to know is if either A, Danny Garcia stated that the reason why he lost to Errol Spence Jr. was because he was dealing with depression, or B, if Danny Garcia just said that he was dealing with depression for the past couple of years. Because there's a difference between those two statements.
Are really dealing with depression, anxiety, PTSD. Fighters like Danny Garcia.
And I'm sure that Danny Garcia, in a way, has dealt with some sort of depression. That's normal for fighters that overall lose their undefeated streak or start losing some of the bigger fights in their career. It happened to Ricky Hatton. It happened a little bit, I believe, to Miguel Cotto when he lost that first fight in his career to Antonio Margarito. It happened overall a little bit to Deontay Wilder. After that loss to Tyson Fury, you know, that ass kicking. I believe that it probably also happened to Sergey Kovalev when Andre Ward thrashed him in the rematch. So anyway.
It is just dealing with the heartbreak of letting his fans and his friends down, coming to the reality that he is not the best in the division and there are fighters that are better than him. That's all he's dealing with. There's no doubt about it. Danny Garcia was definitely depressed from losing to Errol Spence, especially after Errol Spence, he just came off of that near-death car accident. And even though PBC and everyone around him tried to push him to take an easier fight, you know, when it comes to his first fight back, Errol Spence refused to do it. Meanwhile, Danny Garcia was an active fighter. So if anything, it was Errol Spence that was going into that fight with more of a disadvantage than Danny Garcia. In fact, Danny Garcia and his father, Angel Garcia, they agree with my assessment right there. They completely corroborate everything I just said when you listen to what they said going into the Errol Spence fight.
And at the end of the day, after we take care of that, and then Danny's got to go in there and do his thing with these two right here. The ones he got. Because he's not going over the handicap. He got two hands like he does. And anything Spence brings to the table, we're going to respond to anything he brings.
So the sack sap pings me when something I want and stop. Oh, I love these.
Did you guys just hear what Angel Garcia said right there? He said Danny Garcia ain't going into that fight with no handicap. He's not going into that fight handicapped.
You know, that's not new to me. You know, I'm used to playing that role. That's the role they gave me. But, you know, I just have to go in there and be myself. I have to go in there and be Danny Garcia, you know, believe in myself 100%, mentally and physically.
Mentally and physically. This is what Danny Garcia is saying now, going into the Errol Spence fight. So either Danny Garcia is telling us that he knew mentally and physically he could not beat Errol Spence going into that fight, or he's telling us mentally and physically he was 100% prepared, but he just ended up losing to someone that was better than him.
Go in there, fight round by...
Well, I believe that Danny Garcia lost to Errol Spence Jr. because more than likely, at least for the best standards of Danny, I think Danny overall went in there 100% fully prepared to the best of his ability, and I think all in all that he just ended up losing. It just is what it is. And so if Danny did make an excuse about overall, well, mental health when it comes down to that's the reason why I lost to Errol Spence, would it shock me? No, wouldn't shock me at all. Because once again, many of these fighters, especially when they lose some of the bigger fights in their career, especially when you're a multiple weight division champion like a Danny Garcia, and you have a very great amount of pride, a lot of these fighters, they do tend to make excuses. I don't think it's really that much of a deal, but what I will say is this: it is the best upon us overall to not make excuses. That way we can become better individuals. And that way, overall, if you are a professional boxer, that way you can have potentially a better chance of winning some of your future potential bigger fights. Anyway.
Round, make adjustments, and dig deep. And that's what a true champion is made of, and that's what I plan on doing come December 5th. I after the Mikey fight and the Porter fight, I saw some holes in his game, and I felt like it's a good opportunity for me to become champion again.
I really would have loved to see a Mikey Garcia versus Danny Garcia fight. That would have been a great fight. Both fighters, in my opinion, would have been somewhat similarly talented. Mikey Garcia, in terms of a boxing brain, he probably would have been a little bit more talented than that of a Danny Garcia, But in terms of physical ability, because Mikey would have been a little bit smaller, that would have been in the favor of Danny. It would have been a very decent fight. I would have loved to seen that.
So, and he's a great champion. I'm a great champion. And I feel like these type of fights bring out the best in Danny Garcia. They make me run that extra mile. They make me spar that extra round. They make me eat the right meals. And they give me the extra motivation I need. And I feel like...
Well, Danny, what I'll say about you is this. I don't think all in all that your heart, at least in my opinion, has ever been in question. Danny Garcia is never going to give up in the ring. He always is going to show a great amount of heart. But where Danny Garcia is lacking is not only in his boxing ability to compare to Errol Spence, but also his boxing brain. He just does not have the boxing brain of Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Bud Crawford. He just does not have it.
It's the type of fight that's going to bring out the best in me.
Well, guys, there's no better confirmation to what I'm saying than hearing it straight from the horse's mouth, Danny Garcia. Hell, I didn't even have to do any commentary in this video. I could have had Danny Garcia do all of the commentary. Because Danny Garcia, he just admitted in that clip I played that was the best version of him. That was the best version of him going into the Errol Spence fight. Why? Because an opponent like Errol Spence, as Danny Garcia put it, brings the best out of him. But now fast forward to present day. After Danny Garcia gets his win over Jose Benavidez, he's doing interviews saying that he wasn't 50%. In fact, a reporter even asked him if he could elaborate and explain in detail.
So apparently Danny Garcia then did make an excuse. Now Dante, of course, is not always a viable source. In fact, 90% of the time he isn't. But when it comes down to it, I believe it. And if Danny is making that excuse to why he lost to Errol Spence Jr., no. Now, do I understand why he's making it? Yes, I do. But at the end of the day, no, Danny, you didn't lose to Errol Spence Jr. overall because you were dealing with stuff. You lost to Errol Spence Jr. because you're just not the fighter of what Errol Spence Jr. is. And if you would have stopped making excuses, maybe you would have had a better chance with it. But to be quite honest with you, I don't think that Danny, even at his best or even with an improved intelligence, would have beat that of an Errol Spence Jr. And it's no offense against Danny Garcia. I think that he's a very decently great fighter. He is a two-weight division champion. He has some decent wins in his career. But there are levels. Danny Garcia, like I said, he's almost like the Miguel Cotto of his day. He's a fighter that can win a lot of his big matchups. But when it comes to those number one pound-for-pound fighters, he's not going to win those fights. He might be able to give him a tough fight, but he's not going to win those fights. And in my opinion, Miguel Cotto, in my view, he's actually been one of the more underrated fighters within boxing history. Because Miguel Cotto, in my opinion, he's on that same level as what an Oscar De La Hoya, Sugar Shane Mosley, and Tommy Hearns would be. In my opinion, all those fighters are someone on the same level.
What exactly was wrong with him,
and Bernard Hopkins as well.
Going into the Errol Spence fight. And Danny Garcia actually said in the interview, he said, I don't know, I just wasn't myself. That was just 50% of me. So he didn't even really have a solid excuse. In fact, after the fight...
I would agree with you there, Dante. Danny is pretty much saying that just so he can sleep at night and deal with the loss that he had to Errol Spence Jr. At the end of the day, it just is what it is. Now, of course, Danny, because he's very prideful and he's a professional boxer, it's a big deal to him, but to us or certain people that watch the sport, it's not really that big of a deal that Danny Garcia lost to Errol Spence Jr. because he never was really looked at as the best fighter of his time. It just is what it is. He is one of the best of his time in terms of, ability. He is a very decent boxer, but he's never going to be on the Errol Spence Jr. level. He's just never going to be on that level. Danny is a very decent boxer, but he just does not have the mental or the physical gifts of someone like that of a Terrence Crawford or that of an Errol Spence Jr. He just does not have it.
Right after he lost to Errol Spence, Danny didn't use any of these excuses. All Danny Garcia said was Errol Spence's jab was the difference. This is what he said in the post-fight interview right after he lost to Errol Spence. You know, it really trips me out because when Errol Spence and Danny Garcia was sitting right next to each other watching a Gervonta Tank Davis fight, to me it seemed like there was just at least a level of respect to where Danny Garcia wouldn't come out and say something like this. Because even though this is the way Danny deals with losing and it's therapeutic for him to make these excuses, you're still attempting to discount Errol Spence's win. You know, Errol, he actually responded to Danny Garcia.
Well, I would somewhat agree with that, Dante. And Danny does somewhat deserve to be a little bit, scorned for that when it comes down at the end of the day because none of us are trying to hear that shit. But Dante, let's not sit here and cast stones because we all know when it came to one of your fighters that you loved with Mr. Deontay Wilder, you had no problem with trying to deny Mr. Tyson Fury a win, right? Because you're a Deontay Wilder dick rider. But anyway.
Making these excuses, and Errol, he made so much sense in the little that he said. I'm going to go ahead and sum up what he said. But he basically said people are trying to figure out how they're going to pay their mortgage or rent every month, etc. And then he said, nobody cares about some rich nigga being depressed. You ever see some skinny girl who's in real good shape, has a real nice body, and then some person compliments her on her body, and she says, oh, no, I'm fat. And she's saying this while she's standing right next to some girls that are overweight. This is exactly how Danny Garcia sounds. Like Errol Spence.
Well, listen, when it comes down at the end of the day, certain people, even high figures, they deal with a high level of depression as well. Just because someone's life looks great on the outside does not always mean that their life is great on the inside. It just is what it is. For a lot of us, we're on the outside looking in. All right, we don't know what their life is or we don't know what they're dealing with. I don't really have a problem with certain people mentioning stuff about mental health. And Dante, keep those same standards when it comes to your boy Deontay Wilder or one of the fighters that you tend to like. Let's be real, Black American fighters overall when they take a loss. Because when it came to an Adrian Broner or a Deontay Wilder, one of them taking a loss, he would always overall basically coddle them. All right, so let's keep that same energy. So when Deontay Wilder 10 years from now comes out and stated all in all, and he states something about the loss to Tyson Fury, and if he states something about how he's depressed, I better hear the same issue. Well, motherfucker, we don't give a damn because you're a millionaire. What the hell are you complaining for? Bet we're not going to hear the same energy. But anyway.
People out.
And I do somewhat get what Dante is saying. But at the end of the day, once again, I do have to wonder if it was a different fighter, especially if a different complexion, would you have that same energy? I already know the answer to that, but it is what it is.
With real problems, people losing their jobs and wondering how they're going to pay the rent. How are they going to put food on the table because they were living check to check already before they lost the job? Meanwhile, Danny Garcia, he's on his Instagram showing you how rich he is. At the end of the day, if Danny Garcia would have beat Errol Spence, he wouldn't be talking about depression or anxiety at all. This is not some kind of health condition that Danny Garcia...
Well, I would somewhat agree, all in all, that if not for the Errol Spence Jr. loss, that Danny Garcia probably would not be talking about this. Does that mean, excuse me, that in my opinion, that he does not somewhat suffer from it? I believe, especially ever since the Errol Spence Jr. loss, that he suffered some sort of depression. But at the end of the day, that is the main reason why.
The majority of fighters, they go through this same type of depression when they take an L. This is the reason why the majority of times when a fighter loses for the...
Right, and when it comes to one of your fighters, Dante, you'll go to the moon and back to make excuses. But when it comes to a fighter that you don't give a damn about, like that of Danny Garcia, you pretty much overall will say anything about them. So let's be real.
First time, it's a while before they come back. Look how long it's taken Teofimo Lopez to return to the ring. And he's returning against a complete unknown soft touch, which is pretty ironic.
No, I wouldn't say that it's a soft touch. But overall, it is a fight that Teofimo Lopez more than likely is expected to win if he is going to return as a top contender.
Because he said that he actually won the fight against Kambosos and he was robbed and they set him up, et cetera, et cetera. But if he truly felt that way, he would have been fighting against much better competition in his return bout. Let's not forget, just like Danny Garcia, Tio made...
Well, I someone get that when it comes down to it, but, you know, after a loss, it's not always great overall to, you know, even if you do believe that you got robbed, face another top contender. But listen, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, I do somewhat get what Dante's Boxing Nation is saying. But once again, Dante, overall, let's not cast stones, especially when it comes to you, because you make a whole lot of excuses for your favorite fighters. Deontay Wilder, you made an excuse for him. You made an excuse all in all for several other fighters recently when they ended up losing when it came down to it. All right, Gary Russell Jr. was another one. Now, to be fair, all in all, he did end up getting a shoulder injury. And when the Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley fight also ended up happening, overall, channels like these were also making excuses for how Woodley got robbed, and those are bullshit. So anyway.
Excuses for why he lost to Kambosos, but then he ended up turning down the rematch, which you seldomly see a fighter do when he says or claims that...
Or he'll make excuses to why Jamal Charlo looks like shit against someone like a Juan Macias Montiel. Anyway.
He was actually robbed in the first fight. So my point is, Teofimo, he was suffering the same type of depression, the normal depression that any fighter deals with when they suffer their first loss. We've seen Keith Thurman. He admitted that he was really depressed after suffering his loss to Manny Pacquiao, and he disappeared.
Well, that was not Danny Garcia's first loss, but I think that that loss was the most impactful for Danny because he knew that that was the biggest fight in his career, and that if he was someone able to beat Errol Spence Jr., he would get the world somewhat back on his side to maybe believe that he's still the best within that division, and that it would almost mean that he would be completely restarted over. And that the Sean Porter and Keith Thurman losses, that maybe eventually he could avenge them, or they would not mean as much if he's able to defeat a fighter that is clearly looked at as better than Keith Thurman and also that of a Sean Porter, but it didn't happen.
For a while. This is a part of the sport. Danny might have PTSD, but if he does, it was caused by losing to Errol Spence. That's all I got for now, guys.
I would agree with that, Mr. Dante. And when Deontay Wilder got his ass whooped over Tyson Fury, you should have kept that same energy. But that's right, you thought that he got cheated. Even though I know damn well that I don't think you truly believe that in your mind. But it is what it is anyway. But that's really about it for this video. I just thought that that was very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.